Shortly after Gil Evans' death, Miles Davis said, "Students will discover him. They'll have to take his music apart layer by layer. That's how they'll know what kind of genius he was." Well, I discovered Gil Evans when I was a student through Miles' record, Porgy and Bess, which incidentally is still one of my favorite recordings of all time. Since then, I've been pretty obsessed with Evans' style of arranging and orchestration. But let me tell you, it's pretty impossible to take his music apart layer by layer. In fact, I would say that one of the hallmarks of his style is its indecipherability. Is that a word? When listening passively to Gil Evans' music, you hear a strange amalgam, prompting many critics to describe his sound as floating or ethereal. But when I zoom in and try to parse through the music, I find myself in a constant internal dialogue. What the hell is that sound anyways? Look to the Rainbow. That, I think it's a bass solo section. It's such an amazing amalgam. And I don't have any idea what is actually happening.
So my first question to you is, what do you think is happening there? Which there are no wrong answers in this, but I am curious to hear what you think is going on.
I'm pretty sure that it's really hard to tell because Gil is constantly experimenting with new combinations of instruments, new techniques, and pushing the envelope of what is possible to play. So when I made the foolhardy decision of trying to make a video about Gil, I needed to call on the expert of all things Evans, Ryan Truesdell. Ryan is the brilliant mind behind the Gil Evans project, through which he has, over the last 7 years or so, discovered and documented unknown and unreleased music from Gil's archives. With Ryan's help, I've tried to do the impossible in that I've tried to boil down Gil's style and development into 5 key techniques, or rather 5 ways of life really that we can try to emulate to be more like Gil. This is Score Study with me, Brian Kroc.
One. Defy Conventions.
Gil Evans was an autodidact. He learned how to write music through doing it, providing original arrangements for his own dance band while in his late teens in Stockton, California. He seemed to have 2 main goals at that period of his life. 1, to learn how to write by hearing his charts played on a nightly basis, and 2, to challenge his band so that they would practice more often and become a better ensemble. Those 2 key elements of his musical personality stuck with him for the rest of his life. In 1941, Claude Thornhill hired Gil as an arranger, and after a few years, he basically became the shadow leader of that band. Let's look first at a piece Gil wrote for Thornhill's band called How About You. Bob Brookmeyer, who played with Thornhill for a short time, said that Gil would call this chart near the end of sets to keep the band on its toes, and you can hear exactly why within the first few seconds. Okay, I know it doesn't seem like much at first blush, but there is so much going on here. Already so early in his career, Gil is saying, screw the rules. I want to try something I've never heard before to hear what it would sound like. So to me, this is rule number 1 in the Gil Evans playbook.
I have always kind of thought of it as, it's like risk-taking and trial and error and almost a naivete approach to doing it, kind of like, I don't know, I just kind of feel like it's screw everything, why can't I just write flutes in this weird range and French horns in a weird range and,
Right.
be okay with it? Why doesn't that work?
What you're hearing here is a French horn and 3 flutes. Thornhills was the only big band that had a flute section. In other words, it had 3 flute players that weren't woodwind doublers. And Gil has them playing in unison with no vibrato. This is a really hard thing to accomplish. If you don't believe me, try recording yourself playing the same thing 3 times in unison with no vibrato. The lack of vibrato really exposes subtle differences in intonation. But Gil makes it even harder by choosing such a high range in the French horns and simultaneously such a low range in the flutes. I could go on about a lot of other brilliant things in just this short intro. Like the way that he starts the melody on an A flat sets up the key of D flat major, with A flat being the 5th of that key. But then he subverts that key with, I'm not exactly sure what exactly. It's A, B, C. It could be like a A flat 7 alter. Or it could be like a sort of Straussian thing, like an A minor. That kind of third relationship. Basically, he's exploiting the fact that it's a unison, so there's no real harmonic information, and we can't really, grasp what key we're in, and he's toying with our expectations. You feel like you land up there on the root of D flat major, which is already a very high note for a French horn. You think you've made it there, and then he goes even a step higher to bring us to the key of G major, which is a tritone away from where we started, and that all happens in the first 30 seconds of the tune. Or I could point out a huge number of other instances where Gil uses instruments at the extremes of their range. Three bass clarinets play a high F sharp in unison. F sharp on the bass clarinet is an extremely unstable note, and so Ryan Truesdell told me that when he plays that tune, people in the band often raise their hand and say, do you mind if I just play that down an octave?
There's a great story that Maria should probably tell you, but she told me, so when she was working with him, the first time he asked her to write an arrangement of his, or like orchestrate something of his for, I can't remember who it was for, Sting or one of the Paris bands or something. Anyway,
Sting, yeah.
She was kind of like brand new, out of school, sparkling Eastman education, and she came to it and she wrote all the saxophones in the right range and the trombones and down here and trumpets up here, and brought this like perfect, like just executed collegiate arrangement of Gil's reduction that he gave. And she brought it to him the next day, and he looked at it, and she said he just put his head in his hands and was like, no, you did, it's just awful, no, you did it. And she was like, why? No, this is in the roots goes to here, and the voicing and the drop two and all this. And he was, and his line, which I can't totally remember exactly verbatim, but it was basically like, no, all the high instruments have to go low and all the low instruments have to go high because I want to hear them suffering. And when she told me that, so much of his orchestrational choice made sense to me. Because those extreme ranges of the instruments are, one, seldom used, but they sound uncomfortable. You do hear the musician in those moments. They cease to be a specific instrument. It's no longer a bass flute. You start getting meldings of this instrument working harder than it should, and the musician working harder than you should. So you have this other kind of fifth dimension added to the music.
The point is, Gil wasn't a fan of rules when it comes to arranging an orchestration.
Be open to new musical musical developments.
Although they're not discussed much today, the Claude Thornhill Orchestra was one of the hippest bands of its time. We'll talk a little more about this later, but suffice it to say, such a weird turn of phrase. But suffice it to say that Thornhill's band was very influential on the cool jazz movement. They played with no vibrato, which was counter to the prevalent style made popular by arrangers like Fletcher Henderson. They had a warmer sound thanks to the prevalence of woodwinds and French horns, and they played a lot of adaptations of classical compositions. Oh, and they could also play like this. Just how good was Claude Thornhill's orchestra, you ask? Well, Thelonious Monk maybe said something about how they were great, maybe calling them the only good band I've heard in years. In his tome, The Swing Era, Gunther Schuller referred to his records as musical aphrodisiacs. A big part of the reason why musicians like Monk and Schuller, and as we'll soon see, Miles Davis, dug Thornhill's band was due to Gil's creative and challenging arrangements of bebop compositions by Charlie Parker. Bebop was relatively new, so, like any new development in music, the critics had to slam the music at every chance they got. Yeah! But Gil was listening to and learning from these forward-thinking musicians. So when he moved to New York City in 1946, the first thing he did when he got out of his cab was to go down to 52nd Street, and thus began one of the sweetest love affairs in music history, that between Miles Davis and Gil Evans. It's guy love. These dudes loved each other so much for their whole lives. Miles said, "When I first met him, he used to come to listen to Bird when I was in the band. He'd come in with a whole bag of horseradishes that he'd be eating with salt. Here was this tall, thin white guy from Canada who was hipper than hip. I mean, I didn't know any white people like him. Man, he was something else." Okay, so check out Gil's 1947 arrangement of Bird's Anthropology as played by Thornhill's band. You'll notice some curious differences from the codified melody that we all play today. This recording is also an early indication of one of Gil's great gifts. Throughout his whole life, he was open to new musical developments and incorporated them into his own musical world. From his early championing of Cecil Taylor with the record Into the Hot, to his love of Jimi Hendrix, who apparently was interested in collaborating with Gil. God, that would have been an incredible record. To his use of 12-tone rose. To his friendship with Harry Partch, who apparently lent him one of his giant cymbals, and which Gil would play at full volume throughout the day in his New York City apartment, which is just unbelievable to think about, and it makes you wonder if his neighbors ever called the cops on him. Gil was open-minded. He wasn't threatened by new like a lot of musicians that we know. He was excited by it. He wanted to learn from it. I mean, when Gil was my age, he constantly had musicians filtering in and out of his apartment that were a decade or even more younger than him. Doesn't that say something about what kind of person he is? Here's the story. He had an apartment at the time that was just blocks away from 52nd Street, which was bustling at the time with audiences that just couldn't get enough of the crazy new jazz that Bird was playing. So Gil had an open door policy. He never locked his door, which resulted in guys like Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, John Lewis, Johnny Carisi, and Jerry Mulligan crashing there between late night gigs. This is the time when Mulligan gave Gil his anagram nickname, Svengali. Okay, that's enough of that. These young men began to dream up a way of adapting Claude Thornhill's instrumentation for fewer instruments, what they were referring to as their dream band.
We just had to figure out how few instruments and which ones we could use to cover the harmonic needs of a Claude Thornhill's band, you know. Naturally, with a big band like that, you have lots of doubles, you know.
Yeah.
But we just trimmed it down to the 6 horns, you know, 6 horns and 3 rhythm. And those 6 horns covered all the harmonic needs that we had, you know.
They settled on a strange, original 9-piece instrumentation. As Gil put it, they were matching the sound of the Thornhill Orchestra with the new movements of people like Lester Young, Charlie Parker, and Dizzy Gillespie. And this experimentation resulted in an unlikely classic record, derided by many critics at the time, but remarkably influential for the future of music. Birth of the Cool.
Use unusual instruments.
Gil got his love of odd combinations of instruments basically from being spoiled by the resources of the Thornhill Orchestra. After that, he was addicted.
I need more double reeds.
After the success of Birth of the Cool, Gil started to get opportunities to arrange music for people like Johnny Mathis, Teddy Charles, Hal McCusick, and Lucy Reed. Her 1957 record, This Is Lucy Reed in particular, has the craziest instrumentation. We've got trombone, bass, alto flute, English horn, bass trombone, bassoon, tenor violin, bass clarinet and baritone, guitar, piano, bass, drums. This is a wild record. The thing is, he wasn't just using these instruments to be weird or something. He had specific reasons in mind for each new addition to his instrumental palette. It took me a long time to decide on it. I wanted to get a jazz feeling, but I didn't want to use loud jazz instruments. For body and depth, I used the bassoon and 2 trombones. For the top part, I wrote in flute and violin. Furthermore, it's important to note that all of these instruments were handled by a very small number of instrumentalists. Just like in Birth of the Cool, Gil's goal was to make the band sound huge with as few musicians as possible. That same year, Gil made his first record as a band leader, Gil Evans and 10, which prominently featured Steve Lacy's soprano saxophone, and incidentally inspired Harry Partch to use the soprano saxophone in his own music. And Gil did not hesitate to ask titans of their instrument to try something different. Notably, he had none other than Elvin Jones play nothing but the shaker for the entirety of a 15-minute rendition of La Nevada on Out of the Cool. I legitimately didn't know that the shaker could be so swinging, by the way. By 1969, Gil was frequently using electric instruments and writing music that was deeply indebted to rock and soul musicians. He was doing this frequently and publicly enough that none other than Herbie Hancock has referred to Gil as the father of jazz fusion, a distinction which isn't commonly discussed, but which is very valid. Robert Moog gave Gil one of the first Moog synthesizers, and Gil experimented with that a lot in conjunction with a new device called a ring modulator. Gil simply never stopped looking for new sounds, new colors, anything that would add that fifth dimension to his music. His 1975 album, There Comes a Time, features electric bass, bass clarinet, synthesizer, which was very new at the time, koto, and tubular bells, believe it or not. Listen, some of these experiments were more successful than others. But if you want to be like Gil Evans, you have to realize that each and every one of these experiments is worthwhile, even if the final product doesn't sound amazing. Because every once in a while, Gil stumbled on something totally new, exciting, and special. I mean, There Comes a Time, it's not my favorite record, to be honest. It skews towards the weird, and it gets pretty long and a little boring, honestly, at times. There are vamp sections that feel just a little too long, but they provide valuable evidence of the kind of experimentation that was going on in Gil's band at the time, which leads me to my next point.
Be spontaneous.
One of the most common mistakes that a jazz arranger can make is to overwrite. It's only natural to want to have complete control over your artistic vision, almost like your song is a Munchausen's baby that you just want to... But it's completely antithetical to making good jazz music.
This is good rock and roll music.
Music.
The obvious truth is that what's great about jazz happens from spontaneous interaction between master musicians, a fact which Gil learned early on from studying Louis Armstrong's recordings. In fact, he has said everything I ever learned about jazz came from Louis Armstrong. Gil had a special knack for understanding when and how to allow a soloist to have the freedom to create in the moment. His recordings with Miles Davis all benefit greatly from his ability to write in such a way that the listener is often uncertain if Miles is playing composed lines or improvising. Whether he was writing for an instrumentalist or a vocalist, he always took the time to really learn how they play so that he could write music around them in his head. In the early 1970s, Gil had a notable collaboration with a similarly iconoclastic improviser, pianist Masabumi Kikuchi. Kikuchi said that Gil wanted the orchestra to play beyond notation, and that he didn't care whether Kikuchi could read music or not. Remember that tune La Nevada that featured Elvin on Shaker? Well, according to producer Creed Taylor, it took 4 trips out to Rudy Van Gelder's studio before they recorded anything worth using because Gil insisted on allowing for spontaneity. He said, Gil started noodling at the piano for a while, and he started this thing, and the rhythm section started doing something, and then something sparked in Gil, and he walked over to Tony Studd, the bass trombone player, and said something to him. Then he wrote something down on a matchbook, literally. Then he showed it to Tony, who started playing that figure, and then Gil passed it around to the other horn players. By the early 1970s, Gil was moving increasingly in the direction of total freedom, a fact that incentivized people like Don Preston, the keyboard player for the Mothers of Invention, to fly himself to New York City to work with Gil for no pay. With increasing frequency, Gil was attracting some of the best musicians in the world into his orbit, just to get a taste of playing his music.
Be anti-commercial.
At the end of his life, despite his growing acclaim as a musician's musician, Gil was still struggling financially, a fact that took a big toll on his personal life. Gil has said, "The problem with this civilization is that it's next to impossible to have any kind of business reputation without being a chiseler or a crook. You can't just take your fair share and go away." See, from my perspective, the crux of what makes Gil Evans so great is his complete and utter devotion to music. From his earliest professional gigs until the very day he died, he never gave the smallest as to whether his music was commercially viable. Unfortunately, Gil was first and foremost an arranger, so although composers were given royalties for their work, Gil never made more than a small flat fee for each of his works, even though he was filling them with so much original music.
One thing that you said that I think is really important is the word artist. You know, Carla, Anthony, Gil, all of those people you mentioned, I would classify as artists. You know, their main focus is experimenting and creating sound and creating good music, and sometimes creating bad music in the process of reaching for better, you know, bettering their craft and just kind of expanding this beautiful world of art that, you know, in music that we come to appreciate. And the reason why you and I are talking is because we're big nerds for all of this great stuff, you know? And then you look at the commercial aspect of the thing, and then it's literally like, I just need something that's gonna sound like everything else to put behind a car commercial because we need something background music, but no one's gonna actually pay attention to it or care about it. You know, and we're gonna pay you a buttload of money for it versus, you know, you creating sketches of Spain or something and we're gonna pay you a few $100s and then send you on your way.
Yeah.
So I think that's the big key, and I think that was, from what I know from talking to people that knew Gil and his family, that was his obsession. His obsession was sound, his obsession was finding new sounds and creating new sounds and exploring every aspect of not only the individual instruments and harmony on a piano sense, but what you can do beyond the piano in terms of harmony and really taking all those instruments and putting them together in combination with this harmony, and then just really, you know, with everything that we know. Yeah, so I think that's why I've been so attracted to Gil and brought to Gil, is because I see the artistic side of him and the constant reach that he was going for.
Despite himself, Gil did manage to book a regular Monday night gig in 1983 at Sweet Basil. For about 5 years, this became a breeding ground for musical experimentation, and also a vibrant social scene that was attended by whatever heavy musicians happened to be in New York on a given Monday night. Gil also got the chance to tour Europe and Japan, bring his band to the Kennedy Center, and he even collaborated with Sting. His Monday night gig at Sweet Basil brought him long overdue prominence. Despite having 5 decades worth of classic recordings under his belt, it was only in his 70s that he got to achieve some success. However, irregardless of the success in his later life, Gil was still only motivated by one thing. He was searching for a sound.
Well, when Prez came along, people were outraged. Oh, everything that you could think of, they said about him. You know, you sound like an owl. Why don't you play one? All that kind of thing. Well, a new generation comes along and pick up on it. Then the innovator, if he's still alive and not a disaster, can get some credit, you know. But a lot of times, I mean, an innovator can come and go and not have a very good life, you know. Same thing happened with Coltrane. People were outraged at that sound, right? Why do you want to do that when the sound is so good up until now, you know? That's convenience, right? The world's most prevalent addiction. It's convenience, you know what I mean? We all suffer from an overuse of convenience at the expense of passion, right?
Today, when tech tycoons without an artistic bone in their bodies like Spotify CEO Daniel Ek are telling artists that the only way to achieve marginal success in the modern music industry is to pump out a constant stream of half-baked musical product, Gil's legacy is more important than ever. From his earliest days in New York City, spending countless hours looking at scores and listening to records with his young bebop musician friends, Gil was never motivated by a desire to be successful, whatever that means. Gil showed us by example that great artwork needs time, space, and the freedom to experiment in order to truly germinate. Unfortunately, he didn't live in a society that valued art enough to help lift him out of his struggles, and so he often relied on friends, family, and sheer ingenuity to survive. I can't help but wonder, would Gil even have been able to make it in today's music business landscape? Gil Evans' music is fundamentally anti-commercial. It asks the listener to engage deeply, sometimes for uncomfortably long stretches of time. It never relies on tried and true formulas or tries to be likable. It leaves room for experimentation, exploration, and error. It deliberately tries to make the musicians playing it suffer. And in doing all of that, it paved a way for future generations of composers and arrangers to create real magic, to find their own sound. You made it all the way to the end. I didn't expect to see you here. Thank you so much for watching. Check out my scruffy beard. This is what happens when you do nothing but edit video for 80 hours straight. So I just finished a diatribe about anti-commercialism, so I'm not gonna beg you to sign up for my Patreon page, but what I am gonna do is ask you to please support an independent artist. We really got f***ed by COVID, and it's a dark scene out there right now, so whatever you can do will certainly help. Go buy an album, pay for an MP3, buy your friend's artwork, whatever it is, please go do it.